Hey guys, boy, do I have a treat for you today. I'm Jodi Carlton, neurodiversity expert and relationship coach if you don't know me already. And I had the very good fortune to have a chat with Dr. Temple Grandin once again, and also Debra Moore. And they have released another book that's coming out this week on Amazon. And so we talked all about what's in this new book and all about parenting a child on the spectrum, being an adult on the spectrum, being in a relationship on the spectrum, which is what I do to help you guys for a living. So stay tuned, tune in. This is a recording, by the way, you guys. But if you have questions, just drop them in the comments, and I'll be coming back and looking at your questions so that I can answer any questions that you have. And anyway, enjoy. So Deborah and I were talking. I think we first met in 2016 after you published The Loving Push, which, by the way, is still one of my favorite books ever, and I refer people to it all the time. And I can't wait to hear about the one you guys are about to release.
I hope it's still selling well.
I hope so too. I know I'm sending you business. Y'all need to put me on the payroll. So, and we were talking. My daughter Abby met briefly with you at the very beginning of that call. She's on the spectrum, and I was telling Deborah, she just started college this 2 weeks ago. I lovingly pushed her right out the door, Temple. And good. She's doing fantastic.
I hope that worked out well.
It is so far. She's doing great.
Good.
So, well, thank you for reaching out to me, Deborah, to do this video cast again. We talked last year too during the pandemic, which was really nice to chat. So I'm really thrilled to have you both here. Remember, I work with adults on the spectrum. So many of them have children on the spectrum, and they realize they're on the spectrum. They realize somebody's on the spectrum when their child gets diagnosed. And so they come to me, and I work with them to help them in their relationships and their marriages, but also a lot of parenting stuff comes up too in regards to their children. There's usually a parent. Well, there's a parent on the spectrum.
Another book, Different Not Less, that's 18 people telling their own story later on in life getting diagnosed.
Yes. I'm glad you reminded me of that, because that's such a applicable topic. There's so many people getting diagnosed now later in life as the awareness increases of what autism actually looks like in adults after they've grown up and they're functioning adults in good jobs and careers and relationships.
And that's part of the reason they've got jobs and careers is because they learned work skills when they were young with things like paper routes.
Yes. Yep. They're having those jobs.
Paper route substitutes.
Yep. My daughter, I was just telling you about, she worked at Chick-fil-A for 2 years before she left for college. And it was such a good experience for her because she had to learn how to interact with the public.
Right.
She was terrified at first, but it was so good for her. So thank you guys for joining me again today. This is Dr. Temple Grandin, for those of you who are watching, and Dr. Debra Moore. So I would just like to start with hearing about this new book, because I love what you guys write. So I can't wait to read it. And so please, Deborah, who would like to tell me about this book?
I'll tell you about the book. We're really excited. I just got my copy. So it's Navigating Autism, 9 Mindsets for Helping Kids on the Spectrum. And we have, I think, an overarching message in the book is that how parents and professionals, doctors, clinicians, educators, anybody dealing with a kid, how their mindset impacts tremendously the child. So it's about a lot more than just techniques or interventions or diagnosis or skills. It's about how we put this child into context and how that informs each one of those strategies or interventions. So we talk in the book about things like labels. We talk about medical and psychiatric conditions associated with autism. We talk about preparing children for the future, how to work with them in the growth zone in school, teaching daily life skills, how to do a really whole child evaluation, which I think a lot of, unfortunately, evaluations are not. They're too narrowly focused on the autism. And we try to bring in Temple's personal life experience, as well as research as well as my clinical experience. And we give readers checklists so that they can kind of take an inventory of information for themselves. And we give lots and lots of hypothetical examples also.
Well, that sounds fantastic. And, something that comes up a lot with the parents that I work with, where somebody's on the spectrum and oftentimes was diagnosed later in life, so they didn't have that framework as a child growing up to be understood and to understand themselves. So, Temple, I'd like to ask you about that, because a lot of the parents ask me, should I tell my child I'm on the spectrum, or that they're on the spectrum? Sorry.
Well, I get asked that all the time, and I think it depends upon how well the child's doing. What I'm finding with the whole diagnosis thing, and I've talked to, parents with kids and all sorts of stuff. I'm seeing with kids, okay, I'm getting past like the three-year-olds, but let's say elementary school kids and high school kids. I'm seeing too much of the diagnosis holding the kid back and not learning basic skills and getting too overprotected. I'm especially referring to the fully verbal segment of the autistic spectrum. But where the diagnosis has been helpful is an adult who gets diagnosed later in life. That explains why their marriages have been a problem. Because I tend to think in specific examples, and I was at the little newsstand store at the Denver airport, and I had a lady walk up to me and said, "Your book, Thinking in Pictures, saved our marriage because now I understand my engineer husband."
Yes.
And that's where it provides insight and people on the spectrum. So it's almost a relief to find out. But I'm concerned with the elementary school kids and the high school kids. There's too much coddling and not enough learning jobs. Now, we don't throw them in the deep end of the pool. We have to stretch them, give them choices, but we've got to find replacements for the old childhood paper route. For many of the grandparents who get diagnosed later on was really important for teaching them how to work.
Right. I would like to comment on the first part of what you said about the adults being diagnosed and having that framework. I can totally relate to that with the population that I work with. So many people actually come to me in retirement and they're realizing that their engineer husband's on the spectrum, or the engineer himself realizes he's on the spectrum, and it just completely changes the entire understanding of their relationship and how they've been misunderstanding each other and not communicating in ways that they really got each other. So that's been huge for the folks I work with. But I also see what you're talking about just in raising my own children, the whole generation that's being raised and being set off into college, my daughter's age, my son's age. There are so many accommodations. Everybody's got a disorder of some kind, and I'm not wanting to diminish when there are bona fide difficulties, executive functioning, cognitive skills, whatever it is. But like you're saying, I'm seeing that we accommodate so much that these kids don't learn problem solving skills. They don't learn how to actually live.
One of the problems I'm seeing with kids today is they're not learning that, making a mistake is okay. And I think this goes back to taking hands-on classes out of the schools. If I hadn't had woodworking and sewing and art when I was in school, I would have hated it. And doing those things, you make mistakes, then you've got to correct your mistakes. Now, here's something I just found unbelievable. I held up this paper snowflake that's one of the little projects in my book, Calling All Minds, of children's projects. And I had a teacher ask me, and this is real recently, in all seriousness, I almost couldn't believe this. What will happen to a kid's self-esteem if they cut out a paper snowflake wrong and it fell apart? And I said, you get another piece of paper out of the printer and you try again. And then maybe you look it up online on YouTube to find out how to make it. You learn from your mistakes.
Yes. And a mistake, like you said, a mistake is an opportunity. It's not a reflection on our ability or our intelligence. It's an opportunity to learn. And these kids are not being taught that. And that's a little horrifying to me that the educators might, or just parents, educators have that idea that we don't want our children to make mistakes because it might make them feel bad about themselves.
I was kind of horrified when I got asked that question about the paper snowflake. I mean, you've got to be kidding. It's a
Right.
printer paper.
Right.
And it's a good idea to maybe make a mistake on a piece of printer paper. I wrecked a sewing project that was a lot more expensive than a piece of printer paper.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned from that to be a lot more careful before I cut the fabric.
Right.
That mistake again. I had to throw it away.
Right. Yeah. So those mistakes are our opportunities to learn and grow. And, there's this new term, I don't know, there's the helicopter parent, which, just kind of hovers and swoops in and fixes problems for their children. But there's a new term now, I don't know if you've heard it, called lawnmower parent, which actually the lawnmower parent mows down all the obstacles in their children's way before they even face them.
Well, I heard that also called the bulldozer parent.
Okay. Yeah. Same thing.
Yeah.
And these kids are not learning how to, not only that it's okay that a mistake is an opportunity, but they're not learning what to do when they make a mistake.
But that's a problem. And people ask me all the time what we could do if I could change stuff in the education system. I'd be putting all the hands-on classes back into the schools. That's what I'd be doing. Also, they provide opportunities to try out something like auto mechanics, and you wouldn't know that you'd be good at that unless you tried it.
Right.
I'm a big believer in developing strengths, and in the book Navigating Autism, there's a big emphasis on developing strengths. And by the time I was 8, it was obvious I was really good at art. And I would just draw the same horse head over and over again. My mother says, well, let's draw some other things. Let's draw a saddle, the stable. Take that interest, broaden it, develop the strength. And I just want to mention one thing. People are mixing up the difference between a strength, like maybe art strength, mechanical ability, mathematical ability. Those are strengths, or musical ability. And they're mixing that up with an interest, which be horses, cars.
I was about to ask you that.
Those are interests. Strengths and interests are actually two different things.
So can you speak more on that? Because I actually see that come up with the couples that I work with, where they're the spectrum individual, a neurodiverse person, autistic, and I want to talk to you about labels here in a sec, but has a special interest, has something they're very, very interested in, and that ends up really consuming their time. And it, what are your thoughts on how to balance interests and strengths and household responsibilities?
What I think you need to do is you broaden it. Okay, let's say it's cars. That's a real common one. Cars, trains, airplanes, transportation seems to be really common. I think they like watching them move. Okay, we could read about the history of aviation. We could read about the physics of how an airplane works. We can do mathematics with that. And I didn't read when I was age 8. And I learned with phonics. Some kids learn with phonics, others learn sight words. And mother got a book worth reading. That's the first step. Get a book for this kid that likes the airplanes. Let's get a book about the Wright brothers inventing the airplane. Something they'd be interested in. In other words, you take that interest and use it to build the strength.
Build the strength.
It might be music, and he just wants to play the same Mozart thing over and over again. Well, you want to broaden it, or you're going to play some other different kinds of music.
How can I use this special interest to broaden a strength that's actually a useful daily skill of daily living in some way? That totally makes sense. Debra, do you have anything you want to add?
I'd say the only thing that's hard to broaden is when you've got a kid who's stuck in front of the computer playing video games all the time. That is a real problem. And parents, I think, underestimate how much of a problem, how addicting that is, especially for the autistically wired brain. So we've got to replace that behavior. We can't take them cold turkey away from it, but we've got to limit it and replace it with some of the other kinds of activities that then we can broaden those. But it's really hard to broaden a video game.
Well, there's been 3 success stories with young adults addicted to video games with car mechanics, where they were slowly introduced to car mechanics, and they found it more interesting than video games. Because my kind of mind, the visual thinker, I think is the worst with video game addiction. What few video games I've played, I thought I played a video game for 30 minutes and I'd played it for 4 hours. I'm not going to have that stuff on my computer, and I'm not going to have it on my phone.
you mentioned that I think one of the other times I talked to you, and how, a lot of folks on the spectrum are very, very visual and very, think in pictures, very visual. So you just said you're a visual thinker. So can you tell me a little more about what are the different types of thinkers? Would you categorize different types of thinking?
There's science that supports that there are different kinds of thinking styles. I'm what's called an object visualizer, and I discuss that in detail in one of my books, The Autistic Brain. I presented the science for different kinds of thinking. There's the object visualizer, that's me, who thinks in photorealistic pictures. Then there's the visual spatial. This is the more mathematical thinker who thinks in patterns, and music and math often go together. And then, of course, you have your verbal thinker who thinks completely in words. In fact, I was just talking to my sister on the phone about the flooding in New York, and we got to talking about some people we knew that were highly verbal thinkers. She and I are both visual. And I said, well, the verbal thinker thinks totally in words. And she's going, oh, that's so different from how I think. I said, the first step is realizing that different kinds of thinking exist. I discovered this when I was in my late 30s, when I asked a speech therapist to think about a church steeple, and she just got a little pointy thing like that. And I see the churches, and I just start naming them off. They come up like PowerPoint slides. And different people think differently. And these skills complement. I'm working right now on a book on visual thinking, and I'm working with my great co-author, Betsy Lerner, and she's a total verbal thinker. I can't believe how she rearranges my stuff. I don't know how she does it. That's an example of complementary skills.
I love that you said that. I'm sorry to jump in. I love that you said that about it being complementary, because this is something I communicate to my clients all the time, where they're fighting against each other, wanting somebody to come more, wanting you to be more like me. The other one wants the partner to be more like them. Same with parenting children. Why can't you just, but recognizing that the differences are not, nobody's right, nobody's wrong, but they're complementary, and they work so well in harmony when you use those different types of thinking as strengths. So I'm so glad you pointed that out. It's so critical for people. I found this even in engineering stuff. We're working on these great big huge factories for beef industry, or the pork industry, or the chicken industry. And it's very interesting how the engineering tasks are divided up. I have found this on every project I've worked on, where I spent major time out on big construction projects, big beef plants being put up, pork plants. My kind of mind, the visual thinker who thinks in pictures, would do what I call the clever engineering department. Design clever pieces of equipment, think packaging equipment, clever, intricate mechanical things. And then the more mathematical engineer with a college degree would do the boilers, refrigeration, power, and water requirements, and make sure the roof doesn't collapse. And you have to have the whole team. And my kind of thinkers, we didn't touch refrigeration because we didn't understand it. That's something that's much more mathematical and abstract. But in order to build a big factory, you've got to have all the different kinds of minds working on it. Right.
In the book, we've got some examples of in school, in the classroom, how good that can be for kids if a teacher can start to recognize the different kinds of thinking and which kids have that. And when there are group projects, to put mixtures of kids together in a group. Because if you got one group all with, say, verbal, they may do a great job of presenting the information to the class. They're going to lack on the other part. But if you've got a group that's got different, presentation, but Annie can do the drawings, and Stephen can do the math associated with it, then you've got something that is going to be above average. And that's true for whether your kid's in the classroom in 5th grade or whether you're working at NASA. It takes all kinds, just like Temple's book says.
Well, yes, this is the thing. You need all the different kinds of minds to get the project done. And one of my big concerns right now, all the math requirements they've got in the schools, is screening the visual thinkers like me out. Yeah, I think it's a very, very, really big, serious problem.
This is a really important topic because a lot of what I do is help neurotypical people and autistic people learn how to speak to each other in ways that they can understand each other. And so, because those brains are working differently, a lot of my neurotypical clients are more verbal thinkers, and my autistic folks are visual. So I have a question for you, Temple. How, in terms of translating, trying to speak more for someone who's verbal, to speak more in a visual way, how do analogies work for a visual thinker?
The first thing is you have to understand that different kinds of thinking exist.
Right.
And just
first
talking to my
acknowledge it.
sister today, she's highly visual, she's an artist. And I got to talking about the verbal thinking, and she had a big light bulb moment. We had it on the phone just before I got on this call. That's why it's late for the call. And that, that she thinks in pictures, but other people think in words. And it's a different way of thinking. The first step is you have to realize that it exists. That's the thing. And then you got the mathematical mind who thinks much more in patterns, patterns of things. It's visual spatial rather than photorealistic pictures.
So if someone who's more of a verbal word thinker, which I would identify with that, is it good for us to use analogies that are image type analogies to communicate what we're trying to say? Is that something that would be helpful for someone?
I use analogies. I was just reading some stuff about COVID on the vaccines wearing off. And there's a lot of very complicated stuff about two different parts of the immune system. And to explain it simply, I like to use a military analogy because your immune system is like your defenses. And that the immune system that's wearing off, and call it the quick response troops. Those are those antibodies they talk about. But fortunately, you've got this other immune system that has long-term memory. I'll call it heavy tank corpse. And that will keep you out of the hospital. And that's not declined hardly at all. There's a lot of complicated chemistry. Some of the more mathematically inclined people are going to want to throw up when they hear me describe it that way. But I find that in order to sort of describe it simply to the public, that they understand that.
There's a lot of imagery. There is a lot of visual imagery there in the way you describe that. Funny you should say that. When my children were younger, I described their antibodies when they took antibiotics as soldiers. I would tell them this: we're adding to your army, your immune system army. I actually used that analogy years ago. So, okay, so this is really helpful because I think it's not for me, I've got couples, but I also have parents of children who may be verbal versus their children may be visual thinkers. And it's so important, like you said, for everybody to recognize we all think differently, but that's not bad. There is strength in that. So that's the first mindset. That's a mindset shift. And then attempting to speak in that other language when possible to attempt to connect more.
Well, I think to simplify the different kinds of thinking, let's just say my kind of mind, it's pictures, and the kinds of things I'm going to be good at, art, industrial design, and mechanical things, and animal behavior, because animals don't think in words. And then you have your more mathematical person, it's patterns, think music, patterns. I'm just amazed at all the beautiful geometric chemistry patterns I see in science and nature. And then you have your verbal thinker where they think completely in words.
Right.
And if they have pictures, they're real vague.
Right. Yeah, that would be me. I can relate to that.
And another interesting experiment got done that we were writing up, I found online, was they showed people how stuff works. Would you rather read the directions on how to put the IKEA furniture together or look at the pictures? I'll look at the pictures.
Yes.
The more verbal thinker will want to read the verbal description. There's been a number of studies with those sorts of things.
Yes, that totally makes sense. And so as a parent, you want to pay attention to these things with your children and to figure out what's the best way to teach them, what's the best way to understand them, what's the best way to communicate. So are there any other principles that you want to,
Well, I'm learning, just working with Betsy, I'm learning I made her a nice table of information on some data. I thought made it super clear, and she just goes, ugh, my eyes just glaze over. Where I thought I was giving her a nice table that would make it easy to understand.
Right.
That's
But that wasn't her
that I just learned.
Right. That's it. But that's the way it happens with whether it's coworkers, colleagues.
That's right.
We're all different. And so we have to stop and go, okay, how can I communicate? How can I try to communicate this to you and more in your
One thing I've learned about, Betsy being a verbal thinker, when I have to explain something mechanical to her, if I can find something she's experienced, like prying the lid off a paint can, then I was able to explain leverage. I had to get back to something that she actually had experienced.
Okay.
And then she could understand it. When I was on elementary school websites for science class, that was kind of hopeless.
So that goes back to finding something that is relatable. When we were talking about special interests and expanding them into our skills, finding that thing that's relatable to help explain to get
she could understand a mechanical principle if she actually had used it. Okay, I'm trying to explain leverage. You're prying the paint can lid off, and I explained how that used leverage.
Right, that totally makes sense to me.
Now,
and again, I'm a verbal thinker.
I'm seeing it and I'm feeling it. And I said, now the end of the screwdriver might only move a quarter of an inch, but the handle might move 3 inches as you pry off that lid.
Right. So it makes it relatable.
Yeah.
So that's very helpful. Debra, are there any other, any sneak peek insights you want to give us about the book? Any more, anything else you can tease us with about what we're going to read in the book?
Well, let me come back before I talk about the book to one other little point about what we're talking about right now. Is a lot of us, and I'm a verbal thinker too, when we want someone to do something, we verbalize it, and often it's got a lot of steps in it, and we expect the person to remember all of those steps.
Yeah.
And that takes a lot of working memory, and not everybody's got a lot of working memory.
I hate long strings of verbal information. Please give me a pilot's checklist where I can just put down a bullet point for each step, and that will jog my visual memory.
Right. And parents need to recognize that, because sometimes they think, well, I just told him this yesterday. Why can't he remember it? And then the parent attributes it to lack of motivation or laziness. And that's not what it is. We've got to break it down into the small steps, like Temple says, and we've got to write it down or make it visual with a picture is okay too.
Yes. And but this book is focused more on children, but I just want to say this absolutely carries over into the work I do with couples, because this type of thing happens between partners in a relationship where a very verbal neurotypical person might say, hey, can we do this, and this, and this, or this is how you need to do the laundry or whatever. And then it's interpreted when a partner doesn't follow through, it is interpreted as not being motivated, like you said. And the other thing that I see is that breaking those steps down, sometimes neurotypical folks compile 3 steps into one, and we don't even realize that those are 3 individual steps for someone on the spectrum that needs to be broken down even further.
The verbal mind tends to overgeneralize. That tends to happen in the verbal mind, but details matter.
Yes.
And like I always, when I go to the airport, allow an extra hour so that if there's a traffic tie-up on the freeway, I'll still get there. And I visualize it. And I'm visualizing right now past traffic tie-ups on the freeway, like a somehow the whole side of the semi trailer got peeled off like a sardine can. And there was boxes all over the highway, and that was an hour tie-up. You see, and then there's another one where they had to bring a helicopter in to take somebody who was injured out to the hospital. You see, and as I'm telling you about some seeing big tie-ups we had on the freeway, and if I hadn't allowed that extra hour, I would have missed the flight.
Right. And that's something that kids and some adults on the spectrum don't, that executive functioning planning is a learned skill. And so I know my daughter, sometimes she'll forget to add that extra time. She'll know that she needs to be somewhere at 5 o'clock, And then she forgets that, wait a minute, I need to backward plan to figure out what time I need to leave to get there, and factor in variables just like that.
Well, of
What
course,
might slow me down.
Of course, the airport, I've been there a whole bunch of times, so I know how it takes an hour and 15 minutes if everything's perfect. But then as I'm talking about it now, I'm seeing different parts of like this big cluster of gas stations. I'm about halfway there, and a furniture store with tons of trailers backed up to it, and a FedEx depot, and great big one. And I'm seeing
that's
stuff
how
along the way. Yeah,
And that's how you store the memory.
that's right.
Is visually like a
pictures
snapshot.
along the route.
Right. It's so fascinating because I'm verbal and I can't really bring up a lot of imagery in my mind. Deborah's saying no, she can't either.
Well, there was
such a
another
different
interesting
way.
study that was done by the same scientist, and I can never pronounce the name correctly. Close to him the cough. I can never say her name correctly. Marie, who did the original work on the object visualization and the visual spatial. We did another study with students, art students, science students, and verbal humanities students. And they had them put together in teams. They had to design a planet. That was the assignment. So the visual thinkers get together, and one team makes a crystal planet, and another team, fantastic buildings and animals on it. Then you have the more scientific kids, they draw a circle and they tell you all about the gravity and the atmosphere, much more scientific. Their planet looks more planet-like. And then the word thinkers just wrote words on it, and then they erased them because they didn't think they were supposed to have words, and made some colored splotches on it. But the most interesting thing, when she did a second study with these teams of students, she found out that the object visualizers and the math heads, the visual spatials, they sit down, they plan out their planet. The verbal thinkers just sort of like wrote words on it without much planning.
Interesting.
That's what ended up happening.
So some of
They
our
didn't know how they were actually going to make their planet.
and that would really lead into why so many folks on the spectrum are in careers like engineering and architecture, where there's a lot of visual planning involved.
Well, and you see, even when you mathematically plan things, okay, take the Mars rover, the mathematicians got it there, and the guys in the shop did all the beautiful hand-done wiring on the cameras and other parts of the Mars rover.
Right.
Mathematicians had to do plenty of planning to do the trajectories, all the navigation to get to Mars. One of the problems I see in a lot of schools, since there's a lot of verbal thinkers, is okay, we got to have an inclusive classroom, but how do we do it?
Right.
That's the problem. And when I read the study about the verbal thinkers not planning on how they were going to make their planet, well, that sounds like a lot of stuff I've heard.
Well, I think, the same thing happens. I'm sorry, Temple. The same thing I think happens. A lot of psychologists are verbal thinkers, a lot of clinicians. And when they do the evaluation and they write the report, they're not putting it into language that necessarily a parent or a teacher can implement, because there's nothing specific. They're talking in generalities. And that's one of the things we talk about in, I think it's mindset number 2 in the book, is how important it is to make it actionable. And verbal thinkers, oftentimes, we just have it in our head as this general concept, but we don't break it down in a way that other people can use it.
That's really interesting. And, I would add to that. So you're talking about the psychologist's evaluation of these children and the recommendations that need to be like measurably actionable. And the same kind of problem exists with the counseling, the counseling part of this for working with children, but also working with adults, where those of us in this profession oftentimes are hyperverbal. And so we just talk therapy is not, it doesn't work very well. And that's why I use a coaching model. It's like very directive and has these specific scripts for how to communicate, because just talking about how we feel and why we're frustrated, it is crazy making for children, I've worked with teenagers on the spectrum, adults on the spectrum, kids. We in my profession and your profession, Deborah, we have to learn how to not just be verbal in the work that we do. We have to break it down into actionable type
Well, the other thing is, let's look at actionable things that work. I was bullied in high school and called all kinds of names like tape recorder because I just repeat the same phrases. But where I had friends was friends who shared interests, riding horses. We had plastic model horses that we decorated and made Western Parade bridles out of shoelaces. Then I was friends in electronics lab and in model rocket club, friends through shared interests. And the kind of stuff, I just love to talk about technical stuff, how to build stuff. I just find that so interesting. That's much more interesting than feelings are. And I think a brain can be more cognitive, or a brain can be more social emotional. And I noticed that the verbal people will be kind of like a chit chat conversation. They're having such a great time. They're emotionally connected. One of the problems I have is that the whole conversation is going by too fast for me to follow it and even hear even all of it. But you see, I've always said you need all the different kinds of minds, and the first step is recognizing how different they are. And I just had a super interesting conversation today with my sister, who's a highly visual thinker, about verbal thinking, and she's going, "Oh wow."
Yeah, you were saying that you had this realization right before the call, so I'm kind of glad you were late to the call, because you had this great conversation with her.
We had this conversation. I talked about on the church steeple thing, and just how do you implement, how do you do something?
Right. So before we run out of time, I wanted to ask your thoughts, both of you really, but you especially, Temple, on the labeling. And there's Asperger's, there's a camp of people that are really against that term now. Autism, some people, my generation, I'm almost 50 and up, does not associate autism, the word autism, with a higher functioning person that's got a career and family. So that's a difficult word for them. Now there's neurodiverse, neurodivergent.
Well, I was on a call just the other day with some rugby coaches, and a lot of them are very verbal. And I was talking about autistic people, and one of them wrote on the chat, "Well, you should use person first language." And I said, well, there's a lot of people on the spectrum that prefer identity first language. And in my first book, I called it Emergence Labeled Autistic. Then I've got my autistic brain. And those titles were picked out before I even thought about person first or identity first language. And the other problem I have is I'm trained as a scientist, as a biologically based scientist. And I have problems with something called the diagnosis when they keep changing the guideline. I call it a guideline. Okay, now if I have a COVID test, they can run it through a genetics test and tell me I got the Delta variant with some other whatever on it. I can be given a very precise diagnosis based on a piece of lab equipment. That's diagnosis. Or there's other things you can just, this clinical signs, like coughing or something like that, the clinical sign. Nobody's changing the definition of coughing.
Right.
And that stayed the same.
I 100% agree with you on this. And the word you said you use, you said?
I'm going to call it a guideline. I'm not even calling it diagnosis, because
right.
I have problems with something that's half based in journal articles I can find online, and the other half, and I can see it, these little conference rooms, like at the nice Marriotts and Hyatts, the kind of hotels they're going to have their meetings in, sitting around a conference room table arguing about this stuff.
Yeah.
Nobody sits in a conference room and argues about a genetic test for the Delta variant.
Right, where you've got it, it's there, or
you got it or you don't.
Right. So what the word that I use is framework, and so it's similar to you, guideline. I use framework. So when people come to me and they're wanting a diagnosis, and a lot of times I've got a neurotypical partner or a parent who's not wanting a diagnostic label on their child, or I've got an adult who thinks maybe they're on the spectrum and they don't want that diagnostic label on them. I use this all the time. I say, look, this is a framework, and these criteria, you can fall all over the place on this spectrum that we've got. And so it really, when couples come to me, I have them both. I assess them both for neurodiversity, and that's the term that I'm using the most lately, to see where they each are, how, because some of them will both have some of the traits and characteristics. And then other times they'll be way far apart and have very different ways of their brains are very different. And so it's a framework. It's not a black and white yes or no.
Now, it's also autism is a continuous trait. When does a little geeky and nerdy become autism? Okay, you can have a no speech delay type, socially awkward, then going all the way down. Someone may have epilepsy and cannot dress themselves. Mm-hmm. And the other thing I like to do is I like to remind people that we've got some really, really accomplished people on the autism spectrum. I was so happy when Elon Musk disclosed on Saturday Night Live, because these Post-it notes have been in here about 6 years. I had this book in March where I thought he had autism. These are 6-year-old Post-it notes. But
I'm so glad you brought this up, because that's been a big controversy in my group. I have a Facebook group, and I was thrilled when he announced it as well. And I said something in the group, and then there were quite a few people though that were not happy, and they think he's a big fraud. So I'm very interested in your opinion on that.
Well, okay. First of all, I need to ask you: is the Facebook who are the members of the Facebook group? I got to know who the audience is here.
Sure, the audience is adults on the spectrum that are in relationships that are likely neurodiverse. Some of them have partners that they feel are on the spectrum. Some of them are on the spectrum themselves, or they think they are. So it's more about adult relationships.
Well, you see, Elon Musk, I think, is married to his job. He went and bought a boxable house. He looks like a boxable prefab little house, set it up at his spaceport, and that's where he's living. Sold all the mansions. Mm-hmm. He's in love with rockets.
Yes.
He's fulfilling a childhood dream. You just look at what his stuff looks like.
Yes.
It looks like movie sets. And you look at somebody else's launch tower, it looks like this just came off a construction site.
Right. That's true. That's a good point. I'm really glad you brought that up. I'm glad to hear your opinion.
Let's look at people, you can argue about whether they're autistic or not, but Einstein didn't speak until age 3. He would land in an autism class today.
Yes.
I don't care what you call him. He would land in an autism class and get that label. Maybe it's for insurance purposes, but he would definitely have to label.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. And again, so that there again, autism's not this negative thing.
Well, another thing I want to talk about autism is that I'm a bottom-up thinker. Now, bottom-up thinkers think better as you fill the database with more information. So the very good Google I've got inside my head can search it. So the more stuff I get out and do, the better I can think. Because I look back at some of the stuff I wrote in high school, I think it's just rubbish. I didn't have enough information in the database to make reasonable associations. So this is why it's so important to get out and do things. And I've had parents say to me when they finally got their kid out, doing a job in something like an office supply store where there's not too much multitasking, saying, well, he just blossomed.
Yes.
Well, that's big. Or we were just talking about somebody else working at Chick-fil-A.
That's my daughter.
Mm-hmm. A similar experience. You've got to get them out doing things. And somebody that's successful, I can think a whole lot better now than I could when I was 20. And when I was 40 was when I kind of thought I'd grown up and I could really think because I had enough data in the database. It's bottom up. You got to fill that database.
You have to fill the database. I use computer analogies a lot. And so the more you have stored in that database, the more you can pull that code out. You can pull those scripts. You can pull that information that's relatable. And about my daughter, she about a year ago, I really didn't know she was going to be ready to leave for college, but another year of being in the public and working was just huge for her developmentally. And blossom is the right word. She just
I really like that term, and I've heard that maybe three different times where that word blossom's been used. People that hadn't communicated, and I'm interested in what some of people are saying about Elon Musk. One of the things I think that helped him to be successful, I'd recommend reading the first half of that book. You don't need to read the other half about the car industry. He learned to work at an early age, grew up using tools, traveled extensively at a young age. Think of what that would have exposed him to. Had a relative that had an airplane that flew around everywhere and heard endless slideshows about that. and he loved science fiction books. And he's just old enough to have avoided the most addictive video games.
Right.
And he tried to sell he sold video games, tried to open a video game store, and he was too young to sign the lease. He didn't get exposed to the really addictive video games. Also, video games broke all the time. The ones that he would have been looking at, showing screenfuls of code, which if then a geeky kid's going to get interested in that.
Right.
And the thing is, a person develops. You see, I think there's a lot of people on the spectrum, they if you just sit in your room all the time, you don't develop. Mother had a very good sense that she had to get me out doing things. I was afraid to go to my aunt's ranch. She gave me a choice. I could go for a week or I could go all summer, but I was going to go.
Right. Well, and the other piece of that is the sensory system that needs to develop in the brain. And so the body needs to be exposed to all these different sensory experiences so that it can learn to regulate itself, whether it's smell or sound or motion or everything.
Really be an issue for some people. There are some people in the workplace, they're going to have to have a quiet place to work. They might need to take sensory breaks. Some kids, you can reduce a noise sensitivity by having the person control the dreadful noisy thing, whether it's a power drill or a hair dryer, where they turn it on and off. That can sometimes be helpful, but sensory problems are real.
Oh,
Very, very real. And for some people, extremely debilitating.
Yes.
For me, now they are just a nuisance.
Yeah. Well, and over time, you do learn adaptive tools, but the brain also does continue to learn, and it stores that database. I have a really good friend who's an occupational therapist who was the first one that introduced me to sensory processing issues when Abby was 3. And I asked her one day if occupational therapy for sensory integrated therapy still helps adults. And she said, yes, absolutely. We can still help the brain learn how to regulate itself so that it's not so debilitating like you're talking about.
Well, fortunately, about, I don't know, just a few years ago, a paper came out. I was so happy to see this as a scientific paper, recognizing that sensory types of treatments are evidence-based treatments, and they're part of a good program.
Yes, thank you. That finally we're getting some validation too. I know anecdotally it helped my child, both of my children, for sure. So before we run out of time, is there anything else that either one of you want to share?
I'm just really interested. I know this might be kind of, you may not want to use this in the podcast, but I'm interested in why some people in the Facebook group are having such strong feelings about Elon Musk.
My understanding of it is that they see him as attention seeking, and there's a group of autistic folks that are almost elitist, and they it's like being autistic is you're kind of in an elite club of sorts, and that a lot of celebrities are saying that they're autistic in order to try to get attention and get press and PR, and that's my understanding. That's from what I've seen from them, that they see him.
Musk he's had a super successful business before.
I know he doesn't need press. He doesn't need PR. He's doing fine without that.
Yeah, so, and I can totally relate to him totally geeking out and all this stuff. And I have to say that his SpaceX launch to the space station, I was glued to it. And it was interesting watching him in the control room. He would keep going back and forth, looking at a computer, which I think probably was the one that tells when the stages separate, and looking out the window. Very, very intent. And he was like so happy when it was successful.
Clearly, really.
I can really, really relate to that. And when they did the launch, I was just nail biters. I was on an iPad. I was just total nail biters. Then I geeked out on a 2.5-hour live feed of docking at the space station.
Right. Yeah, I was watching that too. Yeah.
And that's stuff that I think's really cool. And for me, autism is an important part of who I am, but interesting career stuff and having interesting things to do comes first. I'm really interested in these different kinds of minds, because a mistake I made when I wrote Thinking in Pictures back in the mid-90s was thinking everybody on the autism spectrum is visual thinker. That's wrong.
Okay.
Multitasking is a problem for just about everybody. You can have sensory problems, but there's the visual thinkers like me on the autism spectrum, the mathematical thinkers, the visual spatials, and then the word thinkers who often love history and facts.
Right. That's interesting you should say that, because it's the same with the neurotypical population too. We have different thinkers in both of those groups.
And what tends to happen, I think, in neurotypical is you get a lot more mixtures of the different kinds of minds.
I can see that, yeah.
In autism is you tend to get an extreme visual thinker, an extreme mathematician,
Mm-hmm.
or a guy that can learn, 10 different languages just super easily.
Well, and that's what we see in autism is those extremes. Even when we do testing, Deborah, I know that you've seen this. We have spikes, peaks and valleys in the test reports. Really, 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 skills up here in the 98th percentile, and then the next one's in the 25th. It's like, so it's those extremes.
But I'm interested. I'm what turns me on, and I think would turn on someone like Elon Musk, is what he does. You see, and I can really relate to that. I remember when I did those dip-back projects that were shown in the movie, I had a very big motivation to prove that I was not stupid.
Right.
That was a huge, huge motivation for me.
Right. Yeah. And that is a thing for so many adults on the spectrum, and kids too, is that I am an intelligent, human being that really has some strengths that I can contribute to the world. And so so many people need.
The other thing, we need to be working on developing their skill area. But the other big problem I'm really seeing, not enough teaching of just life skills. I mean, the amount of teenagers on the spectrum that don't know how to shop is absolutely ridiculous.
The amount of non-autistic kids on the spectrum that don't know how to shop is ridiculous. All of them need help with budgeting, shopping, just using, driving around.
If you teach little kids to save like the way I was taught, then you're not going to run up a whole pile of credit card debt.
Yes. All of these basic skills. Deborah, is there anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
I just want to thank you for having us. It was a great discussion, a lot of fun.
I always love talking to you guys. So where can folks find this book when it comes out?
Now, the publisher is Norton, so they can go to norton.com, or they can just go to Amazon or any local bookstore. It's already up on Amazon. And one other thing I'll say about it is I think we're saying it's not just for kids. It's also, a lot of it applies to adults. It applies to everybody. The mindsets, having a whole person mindset and understanding your way of thinking, that's good for any teacher of any student. It's good for any clinician of any client. It's good for a parent of any kid. They're very applicable.
I'm on,
this doesn't have much to do with,
this whole sort of perception of how some of these people on the spectrum are perceiving Elon Musk. I mean, I think it's wonderful what he's done. I do
too. We're big fans of Elon here. As a matter of fact, during the pandemic last year, my son turned 15 and we couldn't go anywhere because everything was closed. But the one thing that was open was the Tesla dealership. So we went and test drove a Tesla for his birthday. And
did you discover the app under emissions?
No, but I discovered the self-driving part. We had the best time. But Deborah, I wanted to circle back to what you're saying about the whole person. When couples come to me, a lot of times neurotypical partners are identifying the one with autism as the problem in the marriage or the relationship. And I'm constantly saying to them, no. Autism is one piece of this. It's one piece of that person. And it's one piece of this whole relationship. And you're bringing a whole lot to this too. So that whole person thinking is so important for people to hear. Well, really thank you both so much. And, I would love to make this a regular thing. You guys need to just keep churning out books so I can keep meeting with you. So anyway, I hope you both have a great weekend, and I will let you know when this goes live, and I will drop the link to the Amazon, to the Norton publisher, and to the book on Amazon when we push this out to all of my my platforms. So
I just want to help, kids grow up and have a great career. Some of the most funnest stuff I ever did on my whole life was on construction sites.
Yeah. So the whole idea is to help people understand this thing called autism, help make it not such
Well,
a,
the thing is that something like talking about a new forming system for concrete, for example, may be a lot more interesting to me than sort of emotional connection.
Right. So yes, so we have, and like you said a while ago, acknowledging those differences, acknowledging that that's going to be a lot more interesting to you than talking about how we're feeling. And we just have to really recognize that we're all unique individuals, but we all are part of this beautiful puzzle.
The first step is just realizing that different people think differently. Because
Right.
even today with my sister, she didn't, I was telling her some stuff about verbal thinking. She's going like, wow. Oh.
So, well, thank you both again. And I hope you have a great weekend, and hopefully we'll talk again another time.
Sounds
okay,
good.
great to talk to you.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.
Okay. All right, we're going to sign off. We'll see you.